And we are live, ladies and gentlemen. We are live. Welcome to Benchley Night. Except it's not really Benchley Night tonight. It's Matthew Hungold's Hetling Night. We're continuing with Matthew Hungold's Hetling Night for a while. Though actually we may get into our Benchley Christmas programming soon because the holidays are nearly upon us. And what are the holidays without Edith's Christmas burglar? Or even possibly the Birds' Christmas Carol. Now, I'm not going to read that again this year. We're going to take a year off from the Birds' Christmas Carol. Charbonneau says hello. Charbonneau had a very dramatic morning because he was FaceTiming with Betty Sue, who is off on the road with Chris Smither and the Motivators, and he wanted his morning drugs, his catnip, and he stuck his head into the catnip container, and that freaked him out. And he went running around the house with the catnip container on his head, which was very funny, but it was a little scary for him. And I did get it off him. But then he had catnip. He had drugs. He was like Al Pacino in Scarface. He had drugs all over his face. Oh, poor guy. Anyway, he's glad to be here tonight, and I'm glad that you're all here tonight. And so we're going to continue with A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear, because I am presenting Matthew Hungold's Hetling at the Rockingham Free Public Library this coming Friday. We'll be taping that show, and it will be available on the Benchley Night channel. But if you're in the area, you should definitely come see him, because it's our little bit of counter-programming. It's our counter-programming to the libertarian-themed local food conference that they're having at the Opera House. I think there'll be a lot of anti-vaxxers there, too. So anyway, so this is what Matthew Hungold's Hetling writes about, is when fringe beliefs attempt to become mainstreamed and the hilarity that ensues. So tonight's reading is continuing with A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear. You will remember the last reading was Mr. Hungold's Hetling talking with John Babiars, who was the Libertarian fire chief in Grafton, New Hampshire. Now, the next chapter starts with a very disturbing passage. We're gonna skip over some things tonight. The chapter starts with a very disturbing passage about a bear suddenly. This is in the early 2000s. A bear in Grafton, New Hampshire, devours graphically a family of cats. It is a traumatizing incident that is used in the book to illustrate the reemergence of bears. So we're skipping the graphic. You now know, that's all you need to know. That's all you need to know, okay? We're also going to skip the graphic description of dispatching bears throughout history. This is sanitized because our Sunday night readings are meant to be enjoyable for all. Charbonneau is staring at me. Even for little cats. Yes, certainly not going to read about cats being eaten by bears in front of you, Charbonneau. No. The attack on Sewell is the woman whose cats get eaten. The attack on Sewell's kittens, an extremely rare example of a bear eating a domestic cat, you listening, Sharps, would have been strange in any circumstance, but Sewell told me it was only the beginning. The sow that ate Sewell's kittens apparently developed a taste for cats. It taught its two cubs to eat cats, and soon an extended family of bears was predating upon the cats in Sewell's neighborhood. This was not more widely remarked upon is perhaps not as strange as it seems. Though the world thinks of Grafton, New Hampshire as a single tiny town in the woods, it is actually broken up into even smaller, discrete historical villages that reflect an earlier era. And that is similar to my upbringing in Wethersfield, Vermont. The town of Wethersfield, Vermont was actually comprised of Ascutneyville, Perkinsville, Amsden, Downers, Four Corners, Nelson's Four Corners, Wethersfield Bow, Wethersfield Center, Greenbush. There were a lot of kind of Lower Perkinsville, but that got taken by the flood control dam. Statist. Anyway, it's common in New England. It is actually broken up into even smaller, discrete historical villages that reflect an earlier era. Graftonites think of themselves as living in East Grafton, Grafton Center, Grafton Village, Slab City, audaciously named a city by its residents who number literally in the dozens, or West Grafton. Each little village is a neighborhood unto itself, and the encroaching forest has increasingly isolated the villages from one another. Sewell's Village, centered on West Meadow Road, is called Bungtown, named for one or more barrel bungs that once popped out during a carriage transport and spilled a remarkable amount of alcohol onto the roadway. Outside of Bungtown, not many people made the connection between the shrinking number of house cats and the increasing number of bears. But Bungtowners found the bears' taste for cats to be particularly unsettling. Mightn't eating cats, they wondered, be a kind of gateway drug into eating humans? People took precautions. While walking their dogs, they began avoiding the path that ran along the town's rusty old rail lines and other known bear hotspots. Before doing yard work, they might strap on firearms just in case. And they began keeping a closer eye on small children, mindful perhaps of April 27th, 1905, the day that 2-year-old Elwyn Brayley ran merrily around the corner of his family's Bungtown farmhouse and briefly out of sight of his mother. Young Elwyn cried out. His mother would later say it was difficult to tell whether it was with joy or with terror, and was never seen again. The mother blamed a panther or possibly a bear. Many in the community blamed the mother, though no criminal charges were ever filed. At any rate, the cat-eating bears, are you listening, Sharbo? The cat-eating bears of 1999 were just a blip on Grafton's ongoing bad year. June's drought and July's heat wave were quickly forgotten in September when deadly Hurricane Floyd ripped through the region, disrupting power lines, peeling shingles from roofs, and uprooting trees. Over the course of a few days, the town went from parched to inundated. Soon, 500-year floodwaters had gouged washouts up to 8 feet deep into Grafton's dirt roads and completely isolated some of its residents. Grafton's road crew, tiny and ill-resourced, was quickly overwhelmed by the scope of the work that faced them after the floodwaters receded. In a typical example of Grafton's municipal dialogue, someone responded by angrily smashing the windows of the town's one dump truck. It was Sewell's story of cat-eating bears that first drew my attention to Grafton. I was working as a reporter for the Valley News, a regional daily newspaper, and I was immediately captivated by the idea that Grafton's bear population might be exhibiting behavior that lay somewhere on the spectrum of rare to unheard of. At first, I was skeptical that many cats in Grafton were eaten by bears, or even that one cat in Grafton was eaten by a bear. There was no video evidence. And when cats are swallowed up by the New Hampshire woods, blame typically is assigned to other animals, like coyotes. As one pet recovery expert told me, The only way you know is if you find those remains. I began paying attention to notices about Grafton's lost cats, both online and on posters tacked to trees around town. Charbonneau has left. This chapter is so disturbing to him. And I'm not even reading the graphic part, Chart. Mostly white cat with dark tabby patches, or perhaps some black spots. Her name is Abby. We miss her much, read one, while others pleaded for information about Buddha, large orange hair, Bryce, brown black, tiger with white markings, and brother, this is the first time he has ever gone missing and we are devastated. Something, it seemed, was emerging from the underbrush to snatch up felines when backs were turned. If bears were indeed the culprits, Grafton was in the midst of an invasion. Or, as I would soon learn, 2 invasions. Okay, we are now going to skip again, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to skip a very long, not very long, but long enough and disturbing enough next chapter where it talks about all the ways that Graftonites had historically felt bears were their enemy and had dispatched them. From the summer of 1776 until the early to mid 20th century. Let's see. Yeah, we can just go. See what the state did in order to save money. The state, rather than having game wardens dispatch bears, they put bounties on bears so that the citizenry would take care of their bear issue. Groups began to make militia-like incursions into the deepest bear strongholds. Amongst angst over sheep loss, a posse containing as many men as could be induced to join the battle stormed the rocky and ravine-laden terrain of Ragged Mountain for 2 years running. Quote, during this final hunt, so much noise was made by shouting and the firing of guns that the surviving animals, of which several were seen, were probably frightened away, it was written. It took years, it took decades. Untold thousands of animals were slaughtered, bear by bear by bear. Untold millions of trees were felled, trunk by trunk by trunk. Untold billions of dollars in natural resources were liquidated, pelt by plank by perch. When it was over, the settlers raised their grandchildren in a new world, built from the bones of a wilderness that seemingly had been vanquished. Into this intense cauldron of deprivation and bear battling came Grafton's first settlers. Military captains Joseph Hoyt and Aaron Barney brought 100 apple trees, their families, and a few dozen other optimists, hoping to carve new lives from the bear-infested Connecticut River Valley. Their raggle-taggle group included Eli Haskins, already a Revolutionary War veteran at the ripe old age of 16, Captain Hoyt's brother, Jonathan, a shoemaker whose head was destined to be crushed by the wheel of an ox-drawn wagon. Several farmers were with monosyllabic names like Smith, Dean, Cole, and Gove, and Barney's son, Jabez Barney, who would go on to marry a young woman that a county history delicately referred to as Miss Barney. They were cousins. During these first critical years, Hoyt, Barney, and many of the other able-bodied men were called away to serve in militias under George Washington, general of the newly formed Continental Congress. This left the women to care for the children and the infirm. Well, quote, in the night the woods would ring with the howling and fighting of wolves and other furious animals, noted a local historian. The settlers hated bears. They hated bears with the sizzling, white-hot hatred that comes from living in constant fear. But there was something they hated even more, and that was taxes. Grafton's founders had not braved the throat of this godforsaken wilderness to pay taxes. In fact, they demonstrated very little appetite for law of any kind whatsoever. Their first order of business was to completely ignore centuries of traditional Abenaki law by purchasing land from founding father John Hancock and other speculators. Hancock had bought the land from George III. King George had gotten it from God. Once the Abenaki were safely out of the picture, Grafton's second order of business became overthrowing King George, who God had also, it turns out, imbued with the divine right to impose onerous taxes and policies. For example, Britain ordered New Hampshire's foresters to reserve the colony's towering white pines for use as naval ship masts. This decree sparked the Pine Tree riots, in which Grafton area townspeople disarmed a royal sheriff and his deputies, beat them with tree switches, and sent them home on horses that, in an unfortunate example of misplaced anger, had been shaved and de-eared. That's why I love Matthew Hungold's headline. His understated recounting of the grotesque, an unfortunate example of misplaced anger. So good. Grafton settlers, very much on board with the anti-tax, anti-law sentiment, named their community after the Duke of Grafton, a notoriously lusty British nobleman who had earned the honor by suggesting that the crown impose fewer taxes on the American colonists. As the Revolutionary War began to tilt in favor of Washington's forces, Grafton's proud anti-tax revolutionaries got stunningly bad news. The Continental Congress, like the British before them, intended to levy taxes on Grafton. Faced with a new tax bill for the murky benefit of quote-unquote protection, many Graftonites felt like they had merely swapped one unwelcome master for another, and so, safely beyond the reach of both Abenaki and royal law, Grafton's third order of business quickly became the avoidance of U.S. taxes. It's a pursuit that continues today. Just a year after the Declaration of Independence, Grafton produced the earliest surviving record of its disquiet with taxes, a May 1777 petition in which town leaders tried to convince the ruling New Hampshire Council that they should be tax exempt. Even accounting for a certain looseness in spelling common to the period, the petition was glorious in its semi-literacy. It got off on the wrong foot by mistaking the state in which they lived as New Hampshire, and went rapidly downhill from there, referring to state officials as variously your honors, and your honors. We take this opportunity to inform your honors that you demand more of us than we are able to perform, they wrote. They concluded their call for tax abeyance with more pride than word spacings. So no more. The petition, signed by 19 Grafton residents, including the Barneys, was delivered by horseback to the New Hampshire Council, but drew no reply. 2 years later, the town sent another, even more strenuously worded and semi-literate petition seeking tax relief. This one was written by Jabez Barney, whose marriage to his cousin had apparently not disqualified him from taking a leadership role as Grafton's town clerk. Quote, "If we should be obliged to pay the tax that proposed on us and that we expect to follow it would be reduce the most of us to be a spectacle of pity to all human creatures, a great part of our, H-O-U-R, people came into this wilderness in such difficult times that it has almost reduced them to nothing, end quote, he wrote. Though the letters were worded as requests, those who oversaw the state coffers could hardly fail to notice that as the due dates came and went, Grafton's tax bills remained unpaid. Grafton's petitions were in fact part of a simple two-step plan. Step 1, ask not to pay taxes. Step 2, just don't pay them. The foot dragging on the tax paying caused much hand-wringing among the government running. The New Hampshire Council was facing its own financial pressures and could not even afford to pay its modest staff. The council's first president, Harvard graduate Mish Ware, seemed flummoxed at the thought of these country rubes engaging in blatant tax evasion. In an angsty, though grammatically commendable letter, President Ware complained that, quote, the county of Grafton, except 2 or 3 towns, have not paid any taxes for several years, have no courts of law or any proper regulations. I can hardly persuade myself that they are carrying on any sort of negotiation. The Hoyts and Barneys may have lacked a Harvard degree, but they understood that simply withholding payment would not stave off Ware's tax collectors forever. And so they did what any community of reasonable people would do. They voted to secede from the country. The opportunity for such grand scofflaughtry came in January 1781, when Vermont leaders invited more than a dozen border towns, including Grafton, to a formal convention. Though it had contributed men to fight the British, Vermont was technically an independent republic and had no formal standing amongst the 13 U.S. colonies. At the convention, Vermont suggested that its borders could be expanded to encompass Grafton and its neighbors, thereby relieving them of their duties to the United States. The town representatives promptly voted down the seemingly ludicrous proposal and prepared to saddle their horses for the journey back home. That was when the door opened to admit a late arrival, Colonel Ethan Allen, a fiery farmer who had been clapped in irons in solitary confinement during nearly 3 years as a British prisoner of war. Allen well understood the Graftonites' desire for freedom. He hinted to them about the advantage of joining Vermont, by which they would evade a large burden of taxes. Well, the delegates asked, we can imagine their gruffness and skepticism, what about the taxes in Vermont? Vermont's citizenry, Allen smugly replied, paid no taxes of any sort. The Republic's coffers were financed by selling land and chattel houses seized from the Tories. Though this gravy train would clearly run out at some point, the notion of leaving New Hampshire was no longer laughable. In fact, Grafton was smitten. The convention attendees hastily reversed their initial decision and voted to instead bring the secession proposal back to their towns. Once Grafton voters heard about the tax-free nature of the republic just across the river, they affirmed the decision, electing Russell Mason to the Vermont Assembly. Back at the New Hampshire Council, President Ware, nerves already frayed by Grafton's tax intransigence, received a flabbergasting report. Vermont Brigadier General Peter Olcott was raising a brigade of 10,000 fighting men in the Grafton area to help defend Vermont's right to sit out the remainder of the Revolutionary War, or even ally with Britain. Faced with the specter of being beaten by bumpkins, Ware called upon George Washington, then at the height of his power and influence, for help. An unamused Washington, who was still battling the British, vowed that if Vermont persisted, he would, quote, turn his back on the common enemy and lead his whole force against that state and destroy it entirely. Sadly, for the Graftonites, all was not as it seemed. Though Allen had dangled a tax-free republic before them, his actual goal was Vermont statehood. A Vermont claim on established New Hampshire territory gave him a bargaining chip against efforts by New Hampshire to annex Vermont out of existence. In this extended diplomatic maneuvering between New Hampshire, Vermont, Great Britain, and the Continental Congress, Grafton was merely a pawn. For months, negotiations dragged on as Graftonites tried to get used to living in Grafton County, New Hampshire, at the same time that they lived in Grafton County, Vermont. Confusingly, the two states each appointed their own slate of county sheriffs to the disputed territory. Throughout the summer and into the fall, the two criminal justice systems simply coexisted in an uneasy truce, with each sheriff enforcing his state's court orders. The truce fell apart in November 1781 when Isaac Griswold, a deputy sheriff enforcing Vermont's laws, arrested Enoch Hale, a sheriff enforcing New Hampshire's laws. That caused a flurry of escalations, and the Grafton region began to mobilize against New Hampshire. Told that there were 600 fighting men ready to defend the area against him, President Ware ordered the New Hampshire militia to muster 1,000 soldiers for a civil war. Bloodshed was ultimately avoided at the negotiating table when Vermont, having extracted promises for statehood, backed down. Now bereft of allies, Grafton had no hope of standing against the U.S. militia forces, and so it grudgingly accepted the authority of the state of New Hampshire. But forevermore, in Grafton, the United States government, like the British before them, was simply an occupying force to be resisted. In the meantime, there were those tax bills. Russell Mason, relieved of his lofty position as Vermont General Assemblyman, was appointed as Grafton's new town clerk, as he spelled it. In 1783, Mason wrote a new petition to New Hampshire's taxing authorities. As we look on your honors to be the guardians of our rights, our eyes are on you for release in this time of distress. And relief, we pray your honors to grant us, wrote Mason. Such a lack of money was, quote, never experienced by the free people. Our taxes are large and not money in the town to discharge 1/20th part of the tax, and it seems at such an enormous rate. Knowing they had to offer some begrudged token of their fealty to the United States, Grafton made a new proposal. Rather than cash, they announced, they intended to pay their taxes in grain. If any reply came from the Ware administration, it has been lost to history. Next chapter, ladies and gentlemen, the libertarians start to arrive. It's going to be good. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with Charbonneau during this somewhat traumatic reading about cats coming to bad ends. You take good care. Martha Rowley, thank you so much for your ongoing support. It is appreciated. And all of you listening, it's appreciated as well. You take good care. Oh, hey, very tall cousin, if you're still listening, please thank Aunt Dee. The Royal Riviera pears arrived yesterday. I picked them up right when they arrived at the post office. They're in my fridge. I'll be sending her that thank you note. Royal Riviera pears, ladies and gentlemen, a family tradition. They are delicious. You take good care, everybody. We'll see you next week for another Benchley week. And come to the library on Friday if you're in the area, 7 p.m. Rockingham Free Public Library, free public statist. Take care. Bye-bye.